Welcome. I'm glad you can be here today, and I'm sorry that we have to say goodbye to Malcolm. We gather this spring afternoon to say farewell to a man who lived a long and full life. A son, a brother, husband, father, uncle, grandfather, and friend to many. We gather today to grapple with Malcolm's own words. Take from all the wisdom literature of the world whatever nourishes your soul. Live fully each day amid the pleasures and wonder of the human spirit. It is enough. Ask not for an afterlife. And in some way, we are his afterlife. Some of you carry the twining DNA that helped make his body and mind. And almost everyone in this room carries the questions and ideas, observations and insights that he shared over the years. We gather in this moment, on this day, to tell the stories of his life. This moment and this time after his death is a time to tell all the stories, the sweet ones and the hard ones. It's a time to tell the story whole. And that is what I think Malcolm reached for in his life, to get the story to be whole, to get all the pieces pulled together. So we get to hear stories from several different people in this service, and I hope that you will tell each other more stories in the reception in our parish hall after the service and in other gatherings when we can keep telling the story of Malcolm whole. So we'll hear some stories today and tell some stories and feel the emptiness that his death leaves us with. And then we will gather ourselves and carry the best of Malcolm forward with us into the future. I hope you will stay after the service today for the reception in the parish hall, and that you will sign the guest book that is in the hall, so that Pat and Malcolm's family will be able to remember you being here for this day. Some of Malcolm's family will help light our chalice this afternoon. The chalice is a symbol of the free religious tradition of Unitarian Universalism, a place where we encourage question asking. And the chalice today is also a symbol of the spark of Malcolm's inquisitive spirit. Those who wish to, please come forward. I invite you to join in singing hymn 123, Spirit of Life. We'll sing it twice through together. In my last visit with Malcolm, we talked about theology and cosmology and poetry and my young child, all of which were things he enjoyed. Malcolm asked question after question after question. And then there were several times when he shook his head and laughed. That big laugh. That laugh at the mystery and the wonder and the glee of being alive. And then he grew serious again and asked another question. May your conversations with Malcolm go on. May you enjoy that laughter and continue to sort out disagreements you may have had. May your conversations go on so that you can keep making sense of what he means to you and how you live with his burdens and his gifts. I invite you to join me in a moment of silence to honor all of the ways that Malcolm kept reaching for the depths of the mystery of this human life. From Malcolm's family. Barbara Wetherbee will speak first.
Hello, everyone. I'm Barbara, Malcolm's oldest daughter, and on behalf of our entire family, I'd like to thank you all for being here today. Some of you are local, many of you, but some of you have traveled long distances to be here, and we really appreciate that. Malcolm would have been so pleased to see all of your faces here. I have had several months since Dad's passing to think about his life, his journey, the essence of who he was, and the influence he had on our lives. It was daunting to realize that as his oldest child, I've known him longer than anybody in the room, so I go way back. One of the things that struck me is that he was always evolving. He was always growing and expanding, never happy to stay static. Malcolm came from humble beginnings, growing up in Waltham, Mass. As part of a working-class family of little means. As the youngest of 4 children and the only boy, you can imagine that he was doted on, adored, and put on somewhat of a pedestal for sure. His family was very religious, and from an early age, he knew that he wanted to become a minister. He was the first in his family to go to college. He met my mother teaching at a vacation Bible school in Maine, and married at the age of 23, had me when he was 24, and then my brothers Johnny and Pete soon after, and a few years later, our sisters Jennifer and Kara. During these years, we were very much a church family. The image of Dad standing at the pulpit in his black robe, singing with the choir and leading the service, is one that is ingrained in my brain. Our mother played the piano and taught Sunday school. Dad's first church was in Westport, Mass., and he later had churches in Somerville and Malden. He was an excellent speaker. His sermons were relevant, down to earth, and he addressed issues that anyone could relate to. As a young minister, he was especially popular with the youth groups. In many ways, we had an idyllic childhood. Dad organized backyard baseball games for all the neighborhood kids. We spent hours on end at the Little League baseball park. He always loved cars, and he bought a 1931 Model A Ford with a rumble seat just because he always wanted to do that. We would take turns piling in the back of the car with our friends and getting to take rides around town. From his mother, our Mamie, Malcolm inherited an adventuresome spirit. He was always up for going places and seeing new things. While our mother was a homebody and nurturer, Dad was all about going places and doing things. He took us to Celtics games, the Boston Pops, the movies, and the theater. He taught us how to play penny poker. During this time, he continued his schooling, working toward his master's in psychology and ultimately his PhD. He was shifting away from the ministry and evolving into his next role as a psychology professor. It seemed to us that he was always going to school. He had an intellectual curiosity and love of learning that would last throughout his entire life. He was a perpetual student as well as teacher, and never stopped questioning, analyzing, dissecting, probing, and expanding. He instilled in us the value of a good education. Growing up in Waltham, very much a blue-collar town, Dad always dreamed that one day he might live in Weston, the town next door. When I was in 6th grade, my parents bought a lot in Weston and built a house. They sought for us better schools, more opportunity, and an exposure to a whole new world, which it certainly was. By now, Malcolm was a full professor. He taught at several schools, but most notably had a 25-year career at Suffolk University in Boston. As a professor in the 1960s, he really grew into the part. He had a small office downstairs in our split-level ranch in Weston, where he spent hours upon hours reading, studying, and correcting papers. He grew long sideburns and smoked a pipe. There was always cherry tobacco smoke wafting out of that study, with classical music playing softly in the background. Dad continued to expose us to new things. He took us to his school's theatrical and musical performances. He wanted the family to try skiing. So the 7 of us went to Sunapee, where we rented equipment and all learned together, adults and children alike, on the beginner slopes. Malcolm always loved the ocean and was drawn to it, and during these years we rented a small cottage at Rye Beach, where we spent 3 weeks each August. And that's how some of us ended up in New Hampshire. While his career was thriving, Malcolm was drifting away from the traditional life that he had created and growing apart from the family. His marriage was failing, and ultimately it ended in separation and divorce. As a family, we went through a long, dark period of estrangement, hurt, and what felt to us kids as abandonment. It was a challenging time. Dad lived by himself at the beach. He grew a beard. He joined the Peace Corps and went to Tunisia. He had several complicated and rocky relationships. It was a time of soul-searching, and in many ways, looking back, a classic midlife crisis. To his credit, he was not happy with the distance that came between us, and through the years, he found ways to reconnect. He was persistent in looking for openings to be part of our lives again. He visited us during summer vacations, attended holiday gatherings whenever he could, and took our youngest sister, Kara, on several memorable trips. When the grandchildren started coming along, they presented another opportunity for re-engagement. Malcolm was so proud of all of his grandchildren. He reveled in their accomplishments and admired their talents. He loved attending their hockey, soccer, and football games. He took interest in their schools, companies, jobs, entrepreneurial ventures, writing, and artwork. He went to their concerts, performances, graduations, and weddings. He was lucky enough to be able to golf and ski with his grandchildren on many occasions. Malcolm retired at the age of 60 and entered the next chapter of his life. He had 28 years of retirement, which to most of us today seems unimaginable. Soon after he retired, in his early 60s, he met Pat, and in her found a like-minded spirit and a kindred soul. Together with Pat, as one friend put it, Malcolm was a role model on how to do retirement. He continued to live a productive, vital, meaningful, and fulfilling life. He and Pat taught at the Oglala Lakota Native American Reservation in South Dakota. He founded the Civil War Roundtable in New Hampshire, worked with the Exeter Historical Society, and was an active participant in the We the People lecture series here in town. He remained engaged in his community to the end, and as one friend put it, he always had something to contribute. In many ways, this was his happiest and most gratifying time of life. He found stability, contentment, and true partnership. And the adventures continued. Malcolm was more than anything else a people person and an amazing conversationalist. He was perceptive, intuitive, and had a sharp and insightful mind. When I asked family and friends over the last few weeks about what they remember most about Malcolm, it will not surprise you to hear that their answers, almost unanimously, were about conversations, talks, and Malcolm's unending questions. He was known for his in-depth questioning and making you feel that he was 100% focused on what you had to say, absorbing it into his very being. It was referred to as the Inquisition, the interrogation, or the interview. Many of you have been on the receiving end of this. One of his grandsons said he had an amazing ability to drill down. He was never satisfied with a simple answer. He wanted to know the story, the reasoning, the background, and your thought process. As another grandson said, by the time you were finished, he sometimes wondered if you were still even interested in the topic in the first place. Another grandchild said, but he was genuinely interested in what you had to say and wanted to know more. And one of our cousins said, he's the only one who ever really got me. When anyone new would come into the family, we'd have to warn them that Malcolm would seek them out, corner them, and ask them lots of questions, and it could get very personal. Malcolm also loved a good argument. He would challenge, prod, and argue his points with vigor. Heated debates were part of everyday life for Malcolm and his three sisters, and this continued throughout their lives and passed along to the next generation. His favorite topics were politics, religion, and sports, but he could start a debate about just about anything. And at any given holiday event, Dad, and usually my brothers, with a few others drawn in from time to time, ended up in lengthy and heated debates that sometimes got uncomfortably contentious. Malcolm's last chapter was both a blessing and an inspiration. Throughout his life, he always said that every human being had the right to die with dignity and on their own terms, and that is exactly what he did. When he was helicoptered to Mass General and diagnosed with a hematoma in his aorta, the doctors told us that surgery was not an option at his age, and the best possible outcome would be for him to get better enough to go home and live out his days in peace and comfort. As he slowly became more coherent at the hospital and able to grasp what was going on, he became determined to get home. He pushed through weeks of rehab with grit and perseverance and finally did go home. Many of you reached out to him during this time. He so appreciated your company, your notes, calls, meals, good wishes, and kindnesses. When I asked Dad if there was anything else he still wanted to do, he said he'd like one more family gathering, to be with his loved ones and have a few good laughs. We were so fortunate to be able to be together with him for a wonderful Thanksgiving at his apartment. And in an email afterward, Dad said it was the best Thanksgiving he ever had. Everything was just perfect, he said. Malcolm died a few weeks later at home with Pat by his side, on his own terms, with grace and dignity. He knew he was a lucky man. We will miss his presence, his warm smile, our talks and conversations. We'll miss his ideas and his contributions. He will forever live on in our hearts.
I'm Sarah Wetherbee. I'm Malcolm's granddaughter, Peter's daughter. Thank you all for being here today. I think I'll very much be in keeping with the theme so far, so that's great. It's been a few months since my grandfather passed, so there's been time for reflection, and hopefully the wound of his absence has started healing a bit by this point. So I think part of the reflection is not just that we should express our sadness, but also insert a little humor, because my grandfather would have appreciated that. He liked to laugh, and we've already touched a few times on his thirst for knowledge and the way that he gathered knowledge was to relentlessly ask questions of anyone that he spoke with. So. As a grandchild, and I'll speak for the rest of the grandchildren as well, it was always a little nerve-wracking bringing some new person into our family as an introduction, and we did have to take him or her aside beforehand and say, oh, listen, my grandfather, this thing, he's going to corner you and ask you a bunch of questions until you're really uncomfortable, and then we might be able to rescue you and bring you a drink or something, but just so you know, that's how it's going to go down. So in preparing for this celebration today, Pat requested some poetry, which also my grandfather very much enjoyed, and he appreciated a turn of phrase and wordplay as well as humor. So in the spirit of celebrating his legacy, I wrote something, and it's called The Interviewer. How does one establish an intellectual position? Sheer inquisitiveness, bordering on imposition? A penchant for emulating the medieval Inquisition? In Christian mythos, St. Peter's position by the pearly gates requires keen interviewing skills and incredible intuition. The questioning of souls, a delicate commission. So what when arrived upon Peter's threshold, the soul of a man with a certain reputation to uphold? You, sir, for surely St. Peter speaks English. The notes on your earthly conduct, by heaven they distinguish. What say you? How came you? By what right shall you pass? By one or more testaments, you've been a bit of a... St. Peter, good sir, interjected the soul. How long have you worked here? Held this post, had this goal. Surely your time is not measured in years. And what is the meaning of life, since I'm here? These angels, they're yours? Tell me about them. Does the plucking of harps please these sweet cherubim? Do you see all the souls here? Would you consider a prayer? Is there ever a line? Have some caught you unaware? Did Dante have it right in Paradiso? I read it as a young man, and I wonder, con permiso. Sir, interjected the keeper of the gate, your curiosity is implacable. Will this deluge abate? The fate of souls is a delicate proposition, and who on earth can understand the decision? An inquiry from us, then, born of a premonition. Might the investigation eclipse the final condition?
Daughter Rachel was unable to be here today. She is sorry to miss being here, but you did send some words, and a family friend, Gwen, will read them for us.
I've known Rachel since she was about that big, and her mom and Malcolm. I feel sorry for her bad luck. She had a fall, but she longed to be here. So I'm pleased to be able to read the notes that she sent. Is that okay? Can you hear me? Okay, thanks. Malcolm was not merely well loved. He loved well. He was one of the most romantic people I have ever encountered in my life. The way that he looked at my mom with such loving eyes, always calling her darling, how beautiful she looked. He always talked about her with such pride and admiration, like the most beautiful, sexy, awesome person in the world. I didn't merely see, I felt his love for my mom radiating from him when I was around the two of them. You were lucky, Mom, to be cherished the way you were by him. May you carry that with you forever. Malcolm had this incredible way of making everyone feel special and important. When I was networking last week, I remembered that there were four simple words he made everyone remember him and feel like he remembers them. I enjoyed our talk. It's a real gift that made him very endearing, and it was genuine. It's so simple and yet so rare. So Malcolm, in your unique and loving memory, I just want to say I enjoyed our talks.
You may well recognize this old song, Frank Sinatra, What'll I Do? We have the good fortune to hear some tributes from a colleague of Malcolm's and a writing friend. First, Judy Rowan.
Good afternoon. My name is Judy Rowan. I knew Malcolm during the 1970s when I was a counselor in psychological services, and he was a department chair in the psychology department at Suffolk University. Malcolm had a difficult, challenging group of faculty to lead in those days. A veritable case of herding cats confronted him. He did lead them well, and the department offered a solid education for psychology majors. He was also a very dapper dresser at that time, which didn't hurt his image. He wore double-breasted suits, silk ties, pocket handkerchief. He was a very classy dude indeed. During those years, also, I thought Malcolm's major contribution was that through his sincere interest in his students, many of whom were the first in their families to go to college, he created a place where they could learn and grow. They learned to take themselves seriously as scholars and to take their work seriously. Many of them went on to excellent graduate programs where they could continue their work. I mentioned something of this in a note to Malcolm a few years ago. He asked me if we could meet for lunch, and I discovered that what he wanted to talk about was this little observation I had made. He was very appreciative that someone had noticed this accomplishment that was so central to who he was as an academic and department chair. Malcolm made a difference. I can just imagine all of those students going out into the world with an expanded sense of self and of the value of their work, ripples out into the cosmos. In the last movement of a German requiem, Brahms quotes Revelation saying, "Blessed are the dead which die in the Lord from henceforth, yea, saith the Lord, that they may rest from their labors, and their works do follow them." Malcolm's labors are done, and his works are ongoing in the students he taught. Malcolm made a difference.
I first knew Malcolm here at Fuse. My teaching at the academy was winding down. His retirement was in high gear. And at Fuse we had common friends and interests. In 2007, he and Pat joined a Fuse adult ed group on Thoreau that I was convening. And we and others met in the community room or at Peter and Dale Greer's house on Union Street to consider together what Thoreau had actually said and what to make of that enduring challenge. Among Malcolm's hallmarks were intellectual authenticity and honesty, curiosity, and aspirational passion. It was always stimulating and engaging to be with him. Sometime in 2011, he was then 82, Malcolm decided to try his hand at memoir and asked me to help. He had a PhD in psychology and a wide-ranging education, plus he was married to Pat, but his relatively limited literary experience hadn't prepared him for what he wanted to do. I thought he needed a couple of models, so I recommended Frank Conroy's Stop Time and Richard Wright's Black Boy. Malcolm saw the takeaways immediately and began drafting. So for a couple of years after that, we talked mostly about choices he was making in various chapters, along with whatever was going on in society at large. He was an astonishingly quick study, and it soon became clear that the manuscript that became the Pentecostal Boy would deserve readers beyond me. I read it again after Malcolm's death and believe in it all the more strongly now. It holds up remarkably well, both as social history and as an expression of Malcolm's deepest values. So I'd like to try to give you a sense of what it offers. Water Street Bookstore has copies in its biography and autobiography section. Malcolm's ability to present detailed scenes from his childhood was far beyond anything I could have imagined, let alone done. In one early scene, his kindergarten teacher asks him to sing for the class, since she has already heard him on a local radio broadcast where his devout parents had encouraged him to sing for a religious program run by a friend of theirs. The other children are submissive, not enraptured, but the scene is really about the emotional surroundings of his early encounters with his first religious community. The scene recalls his sense of security, his freedom from self-consciousness, as he belts out a hymn for his 5-year-old peers. Malcolm's early childhood was shaped by his parents' devotion to their church. But even though Malcolm's father was a Pentecostal minister, Malcolm always felt free to develop his own ideas, values, and religious consciousness. He had friends at school from a wide variety of religious traditions. Still, he freely embraced for years the earnestness and joy that Pentecostal Christianity exposed him to. In the memoir, he remembers fondly not only the sense of acceptance and peace the community gave to his troubled father, but also his own appreciation of social connectedness and the sense of blessing instilled in him by the congregation's fervent singing of hymns. But other aspects of his own personality, even in those early years, are equally unmistakable. As a child, he is ingenuous, but he is smart, alert, and intuitively ethical. He is ready to honor and follow the persuasive lead of others, but not if they turn out to be corrupt or hypocritical. He has, for example, a deep aversion to racism, based both in the social universalism of the Gospels and in his family's strong friendships with a number of Black Pentecostal families. In one scene, Malcolm is distressed, even horrified, as he watches his own elder sister Marjorie's racially charged confrontation with a local Black girl. And then there are the professional evangelists, the young boy whose ostensibly inspired sermon is obviously memorized, the colorful and charismatic cowboy preacher whose diction is full of pardoners and buckaroos, but whose hands are soft, unscarred, unwrinkled. Malcolm's bamboozle detector rings loudly. Even as a child, he values authenticity highly and tests for it. Several church leaders flunk the test, yet Malcolm views them more in sorrow than in anger. Even after he completes his theological journey from foundational piety to convinced humanism, he never relinquishes his deep feeling for the Jesus who exemplifies compassionate social consciousness and who is unwavering in his commitment to peace and goodwill to all men. As a good many of you must know, Malcolm always signed even emails with those fundamental words, peace and goodwill. He lived by them, even at times when his social and political understanding and his profound sincerity led him to make assertions or ask questions that were startlingly direct, blunt, even provocative. Peace and goodwill were what he was about, peace and goodwill for everyone. So while the hypocrisy of these church leaders contributed to Malcolm's eventual departure from their religious community, he always honored that community's profound gifts to his parents, and he continued to cherish its gifts to him, its sense of joy and meaning in the world we are born into. As these stories move on through the stages of Malcolm's childhood and youth, the stories often come to be about his intuitive attempts to reconcile the faith his family depends on with the sometimes conflicting evidence of his own senses and the promptings of his young but rational mind. One night, soon after his parents and grandmother have taken him to a large evangelical gathering where the adults accept Jesus as their personal savior, Malcolm's parents get into an unusually accusatory and bitter argument in the middle of a family card game where they are each other's partner. In response, Malcolm's grandmother seizes the cards and throws them into the wood stove, whose flames are blazing a few feet away. Still distraught, she bans card games, till then a family staple, from the house on the grounds that they are an instrument of Satan. Malcolm goes to sleep that night perplexed by Granny's conviction that the cards are to blame. His honest question about the source of his parents' fallibility anticipates his movement over many years away from the supernaturalism of his family. But first he served as a Pentecostal and then a congregational minister before completing a doctoral program in psychology and joining the faculty of Suffolk University. Eventually he found in Unitarian Universalism a community of seekers where supernaturalism was not required and where generosity of spirit was the norm. He had either to reconcile or choose between different ways of understanding his experience, and that lifelong quest led him here. At the same time, Malcolm's generous spirit was not a blindfold. Just as he could see both Pentecostalism's virtues and its faults, so in his UU years, confronted by the decidedly mixed record of the secular authorities of our own time, Malcolm would oscillate between charitable understanding and comprehensive fury, especially in the face of politics that offered little or nothing to the neighbors and fellow citizens most in need of support. In the final paragraphs of his memoir, his sustained remembering and reflection on his long experience, Malcolm gives voice to something like a credo, one that expresses both his ineradicable ideas and his idiosyncratic, generous spirit. I came to understand, he says, the great broadening and expansion of what is truly spiritual in one's life. Every positive experience and interaction with another person can be viewed as a spiritual opportunity. Each encounter with nature can also be experienced as a spiritual adventure. Take from all the wisdom literature of the world, you have these words in the program. Whatever nourishes your soul, live fully each day amid the pleasures and wonder of the human spirit. It is enough. These words seem to me to capture the way in which Malcolm came to embrace something like the spirit of this congregation. His example is one of many things I will always be grateful to him for, both in this dear space and beyond it, wherever I go.
Thank you, God, for most this amazing day, for the leaping greenly spirits of trees and a blue true dream of sky, and for everything which is natural, which is infinite, which is yes. I who have died am alive again today, and this is the sun's birthday. This is the birthday of life and of love and wings, and of the gay great happening, illimitably earth. How should tasting, touching, hearing, seeing, breathing, any lifted from the no of all nothing, human merely being, doubt unimaginable you? Now the ears of my eyes awake, and now the eyes of my eyes are opened. That was a poem by E.E. Cummings that was read at my marriage to Malcolm 25 years ago today. Not today, but 25 years ago. The joy Malcolm brought to me heightened the contentment of my life and the optimism and celebration that I feel. Thank you all for helping share this day. I only knew Malcolm the last third of his life. They were the happiest, most contented years of my life. He said that was true for him too. A few years before I met him, Malcolm bought an old farmhouse in Fremont. He went to house building school in Vermont, briefly became a kind of carpenter, and then restored the farmhouse. Former stables became bedrooms, and his huge family room was lined with books and outlined by a huge deck, which he built. We lived in that house until we moved to Exeter. Malcolm was the youngest of 4 children, which you've heard about before. Shortly after we were married, he would leave home and take his 3 older sisters on an annual 1-week summer vacation. He chauffeured them to the destination of their choice. He would stay in a campground nearby in his tent, while his sisters would go tchotchke shopping during the day and motel living at night. He did this for 4 summers. Those 3 sisters preceded him in death. He wanted everyone to know about his love for Ford Thunderbirds. He owned 3 of them in his life, but he courted me in his Corvette. He liked rituals and routines, though there were only a few of them organizing his daily life. Candlelight dinners with music, flowers, and wine, no matter what the meal, fried eggs or baked sea bass. And after dinner, he would go off by himself for 1 cigarette, a mudslide, and a meditation. One ritual that was especially memorable was when Malcolm was quilted in an honoring ceremony by Calvin Jumping Bull at a ceremony at Oglala Lakota College in Kyle, South Dakota. As Barbara mentioned, Malcolm was a volunteer psychology professor on the Pine Ridge Reservation in the fall of 1996. He responded deeply to the indigenous people's respect for the earth and nature. Your soul pulls you toward the canyon. He's told me about the sensation he felt out on the prairies. And he felt he learned an enormous amount from his native students. His cultural education continued when he taught at Haskell Indian Nations University in Kansas in 1998. Malcolm relished tent camping, where he would play with a campfire late into the night and listen to coyotes or owls in the dark. We camped in 8 states, sometimes in mountains, often along rivers and lakes. Malcolm skied until he was 79 years old. He loved skiing with his grandchildren in the West. And he smiled when we skied in France, where we bought senior citizens lift tickets known as le troisième âge. Malcolm loved bicycling, though it was not easy in the hills of New Hampshire. But along the Venetian Waterway and the Legacy Bike Trail in Florida and the Oshwillertook Trail in the Berkshires, he could bicycle long distances. He introduced serious biking and a beautiful Trek bicycle to me. Malcolm's political and social instincts were most often quietly displayed. But way back in 1994, when sexual harassment was gaining notion, he was a sexual harassment prevention trainer of teachers in Connecticut. A male in this field was rare. As a husband and wife team, we think we made a little progress. He supported Bill Bradley in Democratic primary elections in 2000. We drove all over New Hampshire to hear Bradley during that campaign. I usually supported underdogs, he complained. He threatened to vote for Ross Perot. As was mentioned, Malcolm co-founded the Civil War Roundtable of New Hampshire. He was inspired for that project by seeing statues of Civil War Union soldiers in every little town all over New England. He wanted to ensure that people understood and believed that ending slavery was the cause of massive participation of men from every kind of background. The Roundtable celebrated its 25th anniversary 2 years ago and still meets regularly. Always devoted to education, as a college professor, as a Peace Corps worker, he initiated the annual Youth Night at the Exeter Historical Society, which honored his memory for that event just 2 days ago. Malcolm protested the Iraq War in a march in New York City in 2004. He protested weak gun laws and uses of guns by demonstrating on the steps of the Exeter Town Hall in 2015. He openly supported Black Lives Matter. He visited important civil rights sites whenever he could, and went to the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C., the day after it opened in 1993. In 2004, Malcolm wrote his first book, Hey Pal, Save Your Money. His plain-speaking offer of ideas on how to get out of debt and live comfortably on what you have were of life-changing important to some readers. His humble beginnings clearly influenced the themes of that book. If you asked Malcolm what was his favorite anything, whether a place he had visited in Europe, a painting in a museum, or a book he had read, he insisted the world was so full of beautiful places, wonderful paintings, and significant books, he couldn't choose a favorite. That would be limiting the beauties of the world, he always said. But he did not particularly like fiction, unless we read it aloud, and then it was usually Victorian serial novels. He really preferred biographies, political analysis, and history. Malcolm wrote his memoir, as David so eloquently reminisced. By the way, he wrote both books in longhand, many segments over and over. But did you know he loved poetry and wrote a long poem called Ode to the Sea? He worked on the poem for 2 years and in the end showed it to few. He loved the ocean. He had a favorite walk along the coast in Rye and would sit for hours either on the stone wall or a lovely bench, watching the waves, the seabirds, the clouds, Star Island. I want to read to you the first and last stanzas of his poem. And while I'm getting ready for that, our grandson Nathan and Bob Moore will come up because they're going to do a celebration that's related to the poem. While they're setting up, these are the first and last stanzas of his ode, Malcolm's Ode to the Sea. Have you talked to the ocean today? It is a wondrous thing to do. And if you stop and listen, the ocean will talk to you. Some night when you are on the road far away from your beloved shore, tossing and turning from the struggles of the day, you grab a quick wink at the bedside clock, it reads 4. You slowly reach toward the nightstand and firmly grasp the conch of something you have always with you, packed tightly in your trunk. You press it firmly to your ear to await the sound so dear, anticipating the sound you adore. About to hear, with head and back upon the pillow, you hear the ocean roar.
When my mind's in trouble, I walk along the ocean. I watch the morning sun come over the horizon. I listen to the water wash over stones and boulders. I feel the weight on my mind roll from my shoulders. I toss away my blues, I cast them in the sea. These blues I can no longer use. They'll be the death of me. I watch the ocean birds fly over in formation. The morning uses few words, announcing its creation. I go down to the water, I see some others follow. I go to look for daylight, some others for tomorrow. I toss away my blues, I cast them in the sea. These blues I can no longer use. They'll be I toss away my blues, I cast them in the sea. These blues I can no longer use. They'll be the death of me. The death of me. The death of me.
Our door several times during the last months of Malcolm's life to sing songs like that. And he especially liked that song. What did Malcolm bring to me? A big, wonderful family and their spouses. Most surprisingly, instant grandmotherhood. And a great pride, especially in his grandchildren. Their sports performances, some were real stars, their musical achievements, their academic success, their remarkable range of interests. He loved you more than you knew. He brought to me the Boston Symphony Orchestra. He had season's tickets for 50 years, and together we were subscribers for 25 years. In addition to Boston concerts, we drove to Tanglewood every summer for outdoor music. During his last months of life, we listened to broadcasts of live concerts from Symphony Hall on the radio. Malcolm taught me teamwork. We always consulted together about what we would do, where we would go, what we would buy. This teamwork played itself out in his last months, when it took two of us to get him dressed, and we had a system for putting on and taking off socks, shoes, and everything else, so neither of us was bent out of shape. I learned from him the capacity to give and receive forgiveness, which was deeply authentic for him. He also was gracious and generous with praise when strangers like airline attendants or a local cop were especially kind or helpful. He sent letters complimenting them to their superiors. His desk was full of copies of those letters and the gratitude of the recipients of that praise. Malcolm had a probing mind. We've heard about that before today. Always interviewing everybody, respecting the lives of the interviewed. Constantly reviewing the meanings of things, whether political, literary, historical, or spiritual. but he was skeptical of much he read in the New York Times and heard on television. He was at peace with his introverted self and respect of mine. He knew that was the core of both of us and celebrated long periods of quiet while we contemplated what was important to each of us, together and separately. He respected both immensely. Malcolm came to love not only my family, my late mother, my daughter and brothers and sister-in-law, but also my Connecticut and Iowa friends. His open heart and non-judgmental self made every kind of reunion a joyous event. He always encouraged my visits away with them, but loved their visits to us, even when they invaded his quiet daily life for weeks at a time. He had deep friendships, which I learned about from him, with several of you here today, particularly. You picked him up, drove him to your respective coffee houses or beach walks or breakfasts, and talked and listened and shared. These friendships were separate from each other, but significant to his inner self and respectful of his reclusiveness, his hermit-like preference. Thank you. You know who you are. Malcolm taught me courage. He knew his life was threatened and could end suddenly at any time. He communicated his medical diagnosis to many of you with an imminent end implied. He lived each day calmly, saying, "I have no if-onlys. I am happy." His last months were lovely, peaceful, beautiful, interesting. We reviewed our travels and teaching experiences by going through the pages of the albums we had composed after each major expedition. We had our daily cocktail hour, dinner, and evenings of reading together or watching his stars, Rachel Maddow for political enlightenment, and the Celtics or Yukon women basketball for fun. We never missed 60 Minutes unless it conflicted with Patriots football. Malcolm taught me to accept grief. He endured a long, abiding, personal grief and learned deep compassion for emotional pain, which has become a guideline for me. I feel deep gratitude of having had this beloved person in my life, for his love, for my love for him, for having the privilege of knowing and loving him. Gratitude is my bedrock. My life is not empty now. It is filled with joy about our life together and comforted in this beloved community to which Malcolm brought me almost 20 years ago. I want to close with this poem, which was a favorite of both of ours, and one of you at least in the audience will recognize it because it was read at her wedding. This is by E.E. Cummings. I carry your heart with me. I carry it in my heart. I am never without it. Anywhere I go, you go, my dear. And whatever is done by only me is your doing, my darling. I fear no fate, for you are my fate, my fear, my sweet. I want no world, for beautiful you are my world, my true. And it's you are whatever a moon has always meant, and whatever a sun will always sing is you. Here is the deepest secret nobody knows. Here is the root of the root, and the bud of the bud, and the sky of a tree called life, which grows higher than soul can hope or mind can hide. And this is the wonder that's keeping the stars apart. I carry your heart. I carry it in my heart.
I invite you to join in singing hymn 169, We Shall Overcome. Malcolm stood up for and was passionate about racial justice and all kinds of civil rights. So we sing this song for that commitment in Malcolm, but also for all of the hopes he had that we would overcome anything that would get in the way of our ability to live fully each day. Please join in singing, We Shall Overcome. We release Malcolm to the ocean of time, to the tides of eternity. And Malcolm will be part of the grit and hum of daily life. His questions, his writings, his struggles and his hopes and his longings, his conversations. Share a meal, soak up some music, grapple with the big questions of life, and carry Malcolm on into the pleasure and wonder of this human life. Peace and goodwill.
Peter.